So, good morning, everyone. My name is Despina Spanou. I'm Director for Cybersecurity in the European Commission. I'm delighted to welcome you to the third session of Connect University. I see some faces that have already been here the days before. We are also on live stream, and we know that there are hundreds of people who are connecting in the last 2 days. This is a session that is dedicated to digital privacy in a data-driven world. This is, as you know, inherently linked to cybersecurity, the issue of how we protect our data and our data economy. This is a particular challenge. We have a lot of security breaches that consist in stealing data around the world today. A lot of the cyber attacks, wherever they're stemming from, are about the capture of data, individual or big data. And we have very good experts here with us today to discuss the topic. But to honor the Connect University, the first Connect University dedicated solely to cybersecurity for 2 weeks, 35 experts from across the world, our commissioner, Mrs. Mariya Gabriel, wanted to pass a message. She's kept in an equally important event on artificial intelligence, so I am particularly happy to welcome her head of cabinet, Mrs. Lora Borissova, who will share with us her personal message. If she manages, she may come later. This is what she had promised us, but to allow us the program flow, we will now hear her own message from Lora, and we appreciate a lot that you're here with us today.
Despina, thank you very much for the kind words. And it's for me a great pleasure really to be here on behalf of the Commissioner, who definitely wanted to make it today, but as Despina just announced, there is a very, very important event with the high-level group on artificial intelligence, who is actually launching today the recommendations on AI, you know, the trustworthy initiative that we've had, policy recommendations. The Commissioner, by the way, will hold a press conference later today on this and on the Cybersecurity Act, which I'll touch upon now in my intervention. So very happy to be here, also as a former academic, also as following for more than 2 years now the work that we do in this very, very important area, indeed, cybersecurity and privacy. I'll be extremely happy to stay also afterwards and to hear your interventions on that. Let me now briefly, indeed, pass some of the messages with the Commissioner we thought would be important to share with you. First, on the Connect Universities as such, I can but only reiterate what Despina just said. It has been something that established itself indeed as a very important corporate initiative that enables indeed the synergies between the various DGs, and I also see some familiar faces around the table, the EU institutions, and it also certainly helps, but also other partners, and it also certainly helps raise awareness about the ongoing digital transformation, which certainly inspires thinkers and decision makers. Therefore, indeed, we warmly support this year's edition of this university summer school, as such devoted to those two extremely important topics, digital privacy and, of course, cybersecurity. Two clearly very high political priorities for the current Commission, for the Juncker Commission, and I'm pretty sure that these two are going to stay very high on the political agenda for the next Commission. So I'm sure that all the participants at this Connect University Summer School value indeed the opportunity to learn from the best experts, and Despina has been referring to the impressive number. And I also personally, and on behalf of the Commissioner, indeed, thank those experts that are contributing their time and their very precious knowledge. The topics in the program reflect and provide further insights into the implementation of the policies that have been indeed mostly developed by DG Connect under the umbrella of the overall priority of the digital single market. And in this respect, we think indeed that this program touches upon some of the key issues that we are facing as challenges in these fields. Of course, the cybersecurity and privacy dimensions of the Internet of Things, which are becoming even more important in a world where indeed everything is connected with everything. The international dimension, where nowadays cyber and privacy are certainly the probably hottest topics of discussion in our relations with our partners, with global actors on the international scene. The relevance of cybersecurity in sectors where essential services are provided, such as health, energy, transport, banking. I can stop here, but there are more that could be quoted. The need to expand the focus from specific products and services to the entire supply chain. And I'll come back to that. It's the current discussion about the security of our future 5G networks. And also the shortage of skilled professionals, and that's a very important priority of my commissioner, indeed, the focus on skills, in particular when we also look at the women's involvement in the cybersecurity sector, and where indeed in 2017 women represented only 11% of the global workforce in the field. Hence, we definitely and desperately need more skilled staff in the field of cybersecurity, also in the field, of course, of digital privacy. And this summer school, together with the programs like Cyber Aware campaign, that are spearheaded by the colleagues from DG Digit, who are also present here, I think, represent certainly an opportunity to put in practice what we preach to our member states and to all stakeholders in general. So I would like to use this opportunity to very briefly recap the important steps that the EU has already taken over the last few years, despite still the many challenges that lie ahead of us in a domain that is evolving by the day. First, we had the Directive on Security of Network and Information System, or as we call it in a sort of a common way, the NIS Directive, that has been by now transposed by almost all of our member states. We are following this very, very carefully. This is a directive that creates the foundations for increased national capabilities in the area of cybersecurity and reinforced cooperation at EU level. In addition, the NIS Directive, you know it, obliges companies who operate essential services in critical sectors such as energy, transport, finances, or health, but also digital services providers, to take a stronger risk management and other security measures, and to notify significant incidents. The other key pillar of the EU framework that I'm depicting here in front of you is, of course, what we are extremely proud of, is the Cybersecurity Act. The Cybersecurity Act, which is, by the way, going to enter into force tomorrow, and this is what the Commissioner is going to speak today and explain today at the press conference. So we have a sort of a preview of what she's going to say today here. So this regulation, the Cybersecurity Act, a complex regulation, includes first a reinforced and permanent mandate for our cybersecurity agency, ENISA. ENISA, you know, is located in Greece, and the Cybersecurity Act gives it the additional resources for 50% more staff, double the operational budget, which certainly is needed in order for ENISA, for this agency, to do its job properly. Moreover, for the very first time, the Cybersecurity Act establishes a European framework for cybersecurity certification, which we thought was also a very important pillar of this regulation. Again, a few words on that. This certification framework, about which, by the way, if I understand correctly from your program, you will hear much more during a dedicated session as part of the summer school later on. That, for us, means clearly a very real step change in the EU cybersecurity market. In a nutshell, this certification program or framework is the first step towards a real single market for cybersecurity products, services, and operations. Let me just say a few more words here in order to illustrate what the certification framework is aiming at. Vendors could basically serve the whole EU without having to prove their products' merits in each of our individual member states. At the same time, consumers, and we are all consumers, right? You and I, consumers on cybersecurity products today, by the way, privately and professionally, will see better quality at lower prices because of the beneficial competition between the vendors across, again, the whole union. So these two acts that I've been referring to so far, the NIS directive and the cybersecurity regulation, represent, in our view, and I hope you would agree, a strong foundation for European cybersecurity legal framework that could become a global point of reference for regulatory intervention in the area of cybersecurity. All this is complemented further by the proposal to set up a new cybersecurity competence center and network. Some of you may remember that proposal was put forward by the State of the Union speech of our President, Juncker, back in September 2018. And we're very much working, have been working, and will continue doing so with the co-legislator so that we finalize this proposal before the end of the current mandate of this Commission in October 2019. We believe that this new competence center will become a real center of gravity for cybersecurity investments in Europe. If you want me to develop a bit more here, I would wish to say that it goes hand in hand with the proposal we put forward again for the very first time under the new MFF, multi-financial framework, the new Digital Europe program, where, of course, a new approach and much more investments on all these priorities that I'll mention also in a second would be planned. It will bring us at the Commission, but also our member states together to increase and coordinate all the relevant investments indeed in this field, starting with more than 2 billion euros for cybersecurity from the EU budget, from the Digital Europe program that I just referred to, and of course also from Horizon Europe, which is the other very important program for us from this digital perspective. On the external front, I've been referring also to international cooperation in my introduction before. So on this external front, among the key actions that the EU is implementing, we have the cyber diplomacy toolbox, which is the EU's diplomatic response to malicious cyber activities, which sets out the measures under the common foreign security policy. This framework constitutes an important step in the development of signaling and reactive capacities at, again, EU and member states level. This progress is remarkable because we are facing completely new, completely different challenges from what we've been knowing for years. Unlike in the physical world, it is often not straightforward to understand and to be able to prove where an attack, a cyber attack, is coming from. But we need to tackle this challenge to make clear that we will not just stand by and watch attacks on our networks and services, but basically be very, very vigilant and much more proactive on this. So we've been very busy for the last years, very modestly said so, but indeed that's again one of the areas where most important things have been done. And of course, all this is not to say that the job is done and completed. It's not the case. For example, the work on certification is only formally starting tomorrow, as I mentioned it, with the entry into force of this Cybersecurity Act. There will need to be a huge consultation effort from the EU institutions, again, from ENISA, together with our member states and all stakeholders, to develop and agree this first European cybersecurity certification as soon as possible. Because again, we believe that this is very much important for all of us, for our citizens, in order that they feel protected on that. Moreover, there are still gaps to be filled, for example, with regard to national and EU capabilities, as well as on confidence building and information sharing. And since we are talking about intelligent adversaries, all these challenges are likely to remain moving targets to which we'll have to adapt as we go along. And again, we'll have to adapt together with you, together with the experts that know also this area. For the same reason, by the way, that the development is continuing, we need also to look carefully at the challenges created by these new technologies. And in this respect, I would like to mention a little bit the elephant in the room. I would like to mention actually our recent recommendation on the cybersecurity of the 5G networks. You are following, you hear all debates about the 5G networks. I think our recommendation that we released back in March contains a clear explanation of the challenges and of the scope of the problem. It also comes with a rather ambitious, I would say, timeline by which we should agree a common EU toolbox of measures before the end of this year. So the process, the participants and the deadlines are clear, but the content, the actual content will result from intensive cooperation at all levels over the next few months. Again, like in all areas tackling digital, we are convinced that we need an EU approach to this challenge. None of our member states would manage on its own. We need a concerted EU approach. I'm convinced of that. I think we are all convinced of that. The Commissioner keeps saying that. And I think we reach a point where also all our member states realize that that's the case. Looking at the future, we leave in the hands of the new Commission, and of course in your hands, dear colleagues, the same task that we began with, which is of course to keep working on the present cybersecurity and privacy challenges and to anticipate the future ones as best as we can. And in the meantime, over the next few months, we'll certainly continue, as I mentioned it already, to work with the new Parliament and the new Council presidency on the last two pending digital proposals, and that's the two I mentioned already, the competence centers, cybersecurity competence center, and the e-privacy regulation. Just a few last words maybe on this point, which is a very important one. As digital privacy is the subject of the next panel, and we have an expert, certainly an expert, one of the best ones in the face of Despina sitting next to me, I will just mention a few brief remarks on this draft regulation. The raison d'etre of this e-privacy regulation, as we proposed it in 2017, it has been more than 2 years now, is to ensure harmonized rules of the confidentiality of electronic communications. These rules allow, again, our citizens and businesses to communicate in private when they are online. Beyond ensuring a high level of protection of the confidentiality of the communications, the two other main objectives of the proposal that you discuss in the next panel are to create a level playing field, again, a very important principle for us in almost all our proposals, and to support innovation. This is achieved first, just again, concretely, by ensuring that all functionally equivalent communication services are subject to the same rules, independently of the technology used to communicate. That means that the classical telephony that we all know, IP telephony, email, chat, and instant messaging should be covered. Secondly, the e-privacy regulation will create additional possibilities for operators to process electronic communications data beyond what is possible today. And since we don't have a level playing field, we currently have the paradox situation that the same kind of data, for example, location information, can be processed by online platforms, but not by telecom companies. The new rules will bring the same obligations, but also the same, we believe, opportunities for all the operators, and thereby, and most importantly, they will improve the privacy of all our citizens, which is again essential if we want trust in our digital devices, in our digital systems, without which the digital society and economy cannot function. And with this, allow me just to congratulate once again the organizers, by the way, of the summer school, to thank you all participants, to thank all the speakers, and to wish you certainly very interesting and inspiring discussions, which I'll try to attend as much as possible. Thank you. Thanks to all. Thanks, Despina.
Thank you, Lora. Thank you very much, Lora. And indeed, today we're going a little bit beyond the traditional talk of the last 2 days on cybersecurity measures. extending to how cybersecurity is important for ensuring data way round. And indeed, I would like to just give a glimpse of all the work that we're doing on data privacy before passing the floor to the colleagues that we have invited and who kindly accepted to be with us today, both from ENISA but also very experienced researchers in the area of data privacy. And to explain a little bit where we stand, following up also from Lora's very appropriate introduction. So the reason why we are working so much on data is, first of all, because in the European Union, we believe on the protection of personal data as a fundamental right. This is the obvious reason. This is the underlying reason of all legislation we have had in the European Union. And of course, the underlying reason for the revision of the General Data Protection Regulation that we have today was to make it even more human-centric, especially by making the consent the basis for all access that we give to our data when it comes to the data economy. Because it is important, data is an important fuel for the economy, for science, and for the society. And it has become one of our greatest assets, and in Europe we have decided, for that reason, to make the utmost for protecting it through our regulatory framework. Now, we also have very important applications that are coming our way where this is very important. For instance, we discussed in the previous session yesterday the challenges of autonomous mobility and security and how important it will be to shield this kind of new mobility that can bring incredible benefits to the environment and to our society more globally, and to shield it with better security, but also better privacy, because these cars will also become important data centers, data that can be processed also, again, for the benefit of having safer roads, better environmental protection, and for critical infrastructure to play a role in this respect. This is why also the confidentiality of data becomes very relevant. So when we adopted the third mobility package, as we call it, so it was the third package that this commission, this College of Commissioners, adopted on modernizing transport in Europe, we dedicated one of the communications on Europe on the Move on a strategy to make Europe a leader in automated and connected mobility systems. And in that strategy, we put the compliance with both the General Data Protection Regulation, but also electronic privacy rules, because these exist. It is not just the proposal that we have on the table that Lora mentioned, but also the existing directive on e-privacy. So we put them in the heart of the systems by ensuring that manufacturers consider when they roll out and they deploy this kind of mobility, but also infrastructures consider the importance of confidentiality of communications and also of personal data protection. So this is why one of the deliverables of this strategy is, amongst other recommendations, on a data governance framework that enables data sharing in line with data protection and privacy legislation. I know that Athena next to me is one of the specialists when it comes to securing health data. Health data becomes key. After the General Data Protection Regulation, it is well established that health data is personal data. This is a very important development because, as you know, in many healthcare systems in Europe, this has not been the case until now. A lot of health data of patients are held either by the medical professionals or by the hospitals. Now, everybody has to give their consent to provide access to their personal health data. As part of the work that we're doing in ensuring that this is the case, we made a proposal, a recommendation actually to all member states to have a cross-border format for electronic health records. Today in Europe, some citizens have access even through their personal smartphone to their electronic health record. In other parts of Europe, some citizens have no electronic health record. They need to seek through traditional physical means their records from their doctors or from their hospitals. So we know that there is an evolution, that many countries are looking at creating such an electronic health record. So it is important that we create a cross-border environment, an environment by which if you're in another country of the European Union, you still have access or you can still give access. And that requires an interoperable system. And we made a proposal for that that has the two principles of security and privacy by design at its origin. And this is very much linked also at how you will authenticate to access yourself, to access your electronic health record. So there, electronic identity plays a key role. So we are, as you see, we're working also in individual sectors as to how to create this privacy by design. And we're hoping that the infrastructure that will come out of this recommendations, so the infrastructure that will interlink electronic health records, will be an example and a best practice of how you incorporate the consent approach for the access to personal health data in a system that is dynamic, that allows data to flow, but that is based on the consent of the person, of the patient. Now, Lora mentioned the certification framework under the Cybersecurity Act. There is, of course, also the certification possibilities under the General Data Protection Regulation. This is another way of ensuring the privacy by design. If we start meeting security by design, of course, in using the schemes that will come out of the European Cybersecurity Certification Framework, we can ensure an even more protected environment for our citizens in Europe. So we are moving now also to the security by design approach through the certification. And in the coming years, once schemes start coming into the market for the certification of security of ICT products, we will need to see how these can be combined with the certification that will come for the GDPR, for the General Data Protection Regulation. This will be a very interesting regulatory area to look out for in the coming years. Now, we know our commissioner is held by a very important meeting, in fact, of the high-level group that is working on artificial intelligence. Very important element if we're going to talk about privacy and security. Of course, yesterday we had experts in this room who told us how we can use artificial intelligence to also protect our system. So it should not only be used by the offenders, but also by the defenders. And this is particularly pertinent when it comes to the privacy of data. And it is particularly important that anything we do around artificial intelligence does not ignore our principles of security and privacy by design. In fact, one of the recommendations that was made in our communication for artificial intelligence in Europe, one of the priorities focuses on ethical and legal framework that includes privacy and data protection. So also when it comes to our work on artificial intelligence, it is particularly high as a priority and a fundamental element. The guidance that was issued by the European Commission and by the high-level expert group defines trustworthy artificial intelligence as one that is lawful, ethical, and robust, based on fundamental rights and ethical principles, including privacy in this respect. So as you see, again, when it comes to new technologies, we also ensure that we do not just instill security, but also privacy by design. Now, last but not least, I'd like to share with you some examples of the research projects that we are already carrying out when it comes to privacy. And these focus on modern tools that can be available eventually in the market and to the world and to the industry and eventually to our citizens for ensuring that the access to data is done in full respect of privacy rules. So one very interesting example is the Smarty project that works on the security, privacy, and reliability of the data exchange between devices, especially in the area of the Internet of Things. The goal of the project is to create a framework to share large volumes of information for the use in smart city applications, enabling end-to-end security and trust in information delivery for decision-making purposes following data owners' privacy requirements, so based again on the consent. The project looked at some practical solutions, such as the so-called privacy lock that allows tracking to detect when or if an item or a person leaves a predefined area. Its advantage is that the actual position of a person is not revealed. So this deals with the problem of this metadata that people want particular protection for. Another very interesting project is the My Health, My Data project, which aims at fundamentally changing the way sensitive data is shared. The project encourages hospitals to start making anonymized data available for open research while prompting citizens to become the ultimate owners and controllers of their health data. This is about having, again, a very easy to access system that will enable citizens to make their data available, but then hospitals in return for their privacy to anonymize it and make it available to science. This can lead to better diagnosis and, of course, personalized medicine when it comes to serious and chronic diseases. Another project, Operando, allows the users to be truly in control of the data by creating an innovative privacy enforcement framework that will enable that privacy is considered as a service. As such, users will be able to manage their online data and take part in the monetization of their data. So to give something in return to citizens who offer their data, so to have this interactive approach on the management of data once somebody, of course, consents to providing access. Finally, and last but not least, the project types towards transparency and privacy in the online advertising business, very relevant also for electronic privacy rules. It is a project that looks at providing tools that allow users to manage their data, configure privacy settings, and understand the value of the data in the online advertising ecosystem. Today, there is very little understanding, as we know from surveys, as to how far your data travels and is exploited and used or accessed, no matter what happens to it, once you have allowed a cookie on your device. And this is a transparency that we don't have today. So whereas the law requires that you consent for the cookie, and that is even clearer with the General Data Protection Regulation, there is not sufficient transparency as to where your data arrives and how many third parties have access to it. So this kind of projects can help us create transparent rules. This is not necessarily so that it is used in a regulatory framework, but if the market uptakes such tools, of course that creates a lot more trust. And some operators already do that. They provide you with a list of who will have access to your data once you consent to cookies and once you give access to your data on a website, for instance, when you visit a website. So this is the framework of Europe and the efforts that we're making also by investing through Horizon 2020 today. As you know, digital privacy is together with cybersecurity part of our proposals for investment in research innovation in Horizon Europe, but also in the Digital Europe program. The Digital Europe program, which is an industrial program about investment. So we would like to see investments that take privacy by design together with security by design. And we hope that Europe will become a champion in this respect. And we do have with us here some champions that work in Europe on privacy. And I would like to pass the floor to a very dear colleague of ours from the European Cybersecurity Agency that has its special week this week, because it is an agency that is becoming permanent as of tomorrow in the European Union. Athena Bourka has been working there for years. Dr. Bourka, actually, she's a doctor in information security, so a very experienced colleague who has worked for a very long time on security and privacy issues. She has also particular experience in the area of healthcare, if I'm not mistaken, healthcare data security, environmental information systems. She has been a security expert in the Greek Data Protection Authority and the European Data Protection Supervisor, so she has worked also at national but as well as European level. And now she is a member of the team that works on the NIS directive at ENISA, European Cybersecurity Agency. Athena has kindly accepted to talk to us about privacy by design and big data. So how do we reach this project of making use of big data but still meet privacy by design? Thank you, Athena.
I have my presentation. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Commission for inviting ENISA and myself in this very interesting discussion. Could I have the... it's here. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. So my presentation today is about privacy by design in big data. The term privacy by design was already mentioned many times by Despina Spanou, and also the notion of big data. And as you will see in the course of my presentation, I will be using this term to refer also to technologies that are surrounding big data, like analytics technologies that are using data to extract value out of it. So my presentation will have two parts. In the first part, I will explore the privacy challenges in the area of big data. And then on the second part, I will elaborate on how privacy and data protection by design, how this notion can help us face some of the challenges in the area of big data and beyond. So, privacy challenges in the area of big data. As it was already mentioned by Despina Spanou, of course, we're living in a data-driven world, a personal data-driven world, and in this slide I have only put a few cases where we are using personal data, producing, processing personal data in our everyday activities with the use of smart devices, online services, mobile phones, and so on. What do we call then big data? I would say it's mainly a buzzword to, in fact, describe this huge pool of data that is being created by this continuous processing and collection of data. And usually we use these three dimensions to describe big data: volume, variety, and velocity. So it is huge amounts of data, but this goes beyond the traditional notion of a data set. It's unstructured data with different formats, different types, and it is continuously produced. It comes in very big real-time streams, either physical, streams from physical sensors, for example, or data from social media, and so on. At the end, if we just think of all the processing that we do online, all the big companies or smaller companies that are collecting data every day from our online activities and are exchanged this data between these companies, this is what I would call big data. This is this huge and unprecedented, I would say, pool of data. And of course, big data in itself, it is big data, it is just data, but it makes a lot more sense and it has a lot more value when you analyze this data. So we have this whole area of big data analytics, which is about combining data, correlating data, using data in several different forms so as to extract value out of this, value that can help us towards different areas of innovation. Some were already mentioned by Despina before, and machine learning, perhaps you have heard this term already as well. It's using algorithms which are trained from this data so as to create, for example, predictive analysis models that can understand human behavior at the end, and this, of course, can help us create autonomous agents, artificial intelligence systems, and so on. This is the whole picture. So data is the basis which can be used and can give us value out of it to create a lot more tools that are very important and innovative, obviously, and useful in our societies today. However, this does not come without cost, and of course, privacy is one of the areas that is highly impacted in this type of new digital, let's say, economy, digital society. What are the key challenges? I would say, first of all, one very important challenge is loss of control. Obviously, since data collection is based on so many different and unexpected sources, with a chain of different actors that are exchanging data, control can be easily lost. There's no information, there's no choice. And you can find a very easy example that we all experience in the area of mobile apps. How many times has an app asked you to consent to processing something, to connect to some data, to give you access to some data, so as to provide you with a service? It's something that is happening all the time. And of course, in most of the cases, we would consent to that because we want to use the application, but what happens with this data? Who takes it? How is it exchanged? How is it connected with other data? Then we lose control. Then, of course, exactly because we lose control, it is also very easy that these data are being reused for other purposes. They are initially collected for a purpose, but of course, it is very easy, since they are there, they are available, to be used beyond the original purpose. And again, an example that perhaps you have also seen online, this usual, let's say, purpose of improvement of service, better user experience that we see in many instances for the use of our data online. If we understand what it means, we don't sometimes even have the possibility to say no to this. Then another very important challenge is at the end, I would say, a security challenge. Obviously, we have already an increasing threat landscape in the cyber, but I think that now beyond the traditional, let's say, cyber threats, for example, of unauthorized access to information or leakage of data, we also have the challenge of data inference and re-identification. What does this mean? It means that a piece of information that might have no value in itself, might not reveal any data, when it is combined with other data, it might immediately become personal data, re-identify individuals. Actually, this is the case of significant data breaches that we have experienced in the past, and I have mentioned here some of them in my slide. For example, the New York taxi rides case in 2014 was exactly like this. The taxi rides were anonymized and provided online due to transparency obligation. But, of course, these anonymized taxi rides, when combined with several other data that are available in the big data, led to the identification of specific people. And as I said, we have many other cases relevant to that here. And then another very important challenge also linked to that is tracking and profiling. So tracking, first of all, it's important to know that it doesn't need necessarily to identify me physically as a person. It is possible to conduct tracking only by an online identifier, like a cookie, for example, which can uniquely single out a person from everybody else in the group. And based on tracking, we can have profiling, which means classifying individuals based on certain characteristics, like preferences, social behavior, health status, and so on. And again, we have a very usual example here that we are all experiencing every day. Online targeted advertising, it works exactly this way. It tracks us across different websites, and through this information that is collected by tracking, profiles are created, and these profiles are used to serve as targeted ads. It's exactly this case. And then, of course, if we can have profiles, we can also have automated decision-making without human intervention. So based on the profiles, it is possible to offer services or exclude from services, and this, of course, can lead to isolation, to discrimination, and so on. Like, for example, when you have a machine deciding based on algorithms that have been trained with biased data sets, or when a mistake is made. So, of course, another important aspect here to consider is that privacy challenges are important. Why? Because they also impact several other rights and freedoms of ours. They can have a detrimental effect on our everyday life, private life. And so imagine, for example, a case where an app would decide that Romeo is not the perfect match for Juliet. It would be totally detrimental for Romeo and for all of us as well. So I think that that's why it's so important. It's important to understand that privacy is not just about itself, let's say. Privacy is not for the sake of privacy. It's for the sake of very other fundamental values of our everyday life. So is big data the end of privacy? After this very let's say, pessimistic approach I have followed until now. I have heard several answers to this question. Some of them are optimistic, some of them are pessimistic. My answer to this question would be, it depends. It depends on how we do it. And here I would like to quote Tim Berners-Lee, the father of the internet, who said that we cannot blame the technology when we make mistakes. So I believe that if we let big data and these new technologies become the end of privacy, it would be because we have made a mistake. We did it in the wrong way. Can we do it in a different way? I think that yes, we can. And we should not forget that in Europe, first of all, we have a robust legal framework for the protection of personal data. We have the General Data Protection Regulation, which already in its core principles answers several of the questions that I mentioned before. For example, purpose limitation, the principle of purpose limitation means that data cannot be used beyond the original scope of collection. Or the principle of data minimization means that data should be used only in the context and for the purpose that they are that they are necessary. Should not be used more data for one specific purpose. And of course, individuals have certain rights, and there are also obligations for controllers. I'm not going to go in a detailed analysis of the legal framework in this presentation. As it was also mentioned before, this is not the only law that we have in Europe. We also have the e-privacy directive, which provides also several controls for privacy in electronic communications. But of course, this is not enough. We do have the law in place, but how do we put it in practice? How can the law be used and implemented in systems and services? This is the real challenge. And here I would like to quote also what we have said in ENISA in past work in the field, that actually the discussion of big data versus privacy is the wrong type of discussion. We should rather be discussing about big data with privacy. How can we do big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning in a way that is privacy enhancing? And to this end, we need to look into technologies that are embracing privacy as a core aspect. And also, we need to look into technologies for privacy. We can use the technology to face the challenges of technology. We can do both. And to this end, I believe that the concept of privacy and data protection by design is fundamental. It's at the core, the heart of this discussion, and this is where we should be aiming at. So, in the second part of my presentation, I will talk exactly about this. I will briefly try to explain what is the concept of privacy and data protection by design, and I will make 3 observations which I believe are important for practical implementation, generally, but also in the area of big data. So, I think that actually the concept of privacy and data protection by design is quite simple in its conception, and I will make here the comparison with the building of a house. When we build a house, we need to have plans. We need to have everything detailed in the plans. We need to have all the functional requirements there. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to take into consideration some aspects later on. Well, some of them might be impossible to change. It's exactly the same when we design a new system, a new application, but also a new process, even if that is not a technical process, a new procedure. It's exactly the same. So the concept of data protection and privacy and data protection by design actually says that privacy and data protection need to be one of these functional requirements. Together with everything else, we need to consider that as a functional requirement at the very beginning. It needs to be in the plan. In GDPR, we also have an obligation now for data controllers to do so. It's Article 25, to design in the way that implements the data protection principles. I think that this idea is fundamental, truly fundamental, in building privacy into systems, services, and applications, but also into processes, into procedures, in the everyday life ways of operation that we have. So I said before, I will make 3 observations. So my first observation is that at the end, the notion of by design means think privacy. It is about engineering privacy and data protection into systems and services. And to this end, of course, it has a very strong technical dimension. ENISA has been working on that, and I will come to that later in my presentation. But it's not only technical, and I really want to insist on that. It's also about procedures, it's about process, it's about people. It's a strategic change. And as such, it can have some quick wins, but also some big challenges. So think privacy means design privacy. This is my first observation. The second one is, of course, like in the construction of a house, we need to have a plan. Design needs a plan. Do we have a plan? This is a question that has been troubling researchers over the years. How do we engineer privacy into systems and services, especially new technologies that are on the edge, that have the challenges that I mentioned before? There's not only one answer here. What I would say is that, of course, we do have a starting point. We do have, at least in the European Union, principles. We have data protection principles in place, so we start from there. And then there are different approaches how to implement it here. I will only show you one approach that we quoted since 2014 in ENISA's report on privacy and data protection by design, which is the notion of design strategies. So create strategies that can be used at the design phase, which are interpreting, let's say, the data protection principles into more tangible things that can be implemented later on with relevant technologies. So, for example, we have the strategy of minimize, which means use as much as the least possible data for the processing. And this does not necessarily mean that we reduce the amount of data per se. We might reduce the way that we access this data, and there are technologies to do so. Or similarly, the other privacy strategies hide, separate, aggregate, and so on. I don't have the time to go into detail in all this, but I would like to say that also in the area of big data analytics, in past work that we have done at ENISA, in our report on privacy by design in big data, we tried actually to map these different strategies into the different phases of big data value chain, and also to somehow connect them with relevant implementation techniques. So how can we build privacy into the data collection phase? How can we build privacy into the analysis phase? And here, for example, I would give the case of aggregation, which is a very important design strategy. Designing, for big data, I believe, designing in a way that data are used at the highest possible level of aggregation so that identification of individuals becomes more difficult. And there are several technologies here, including data anonymization. I believe we are going to hear about that later on in this panel. And then, of course, my last point, design needs technology. We need to have tools in place. We need to have technologies in place. But again, here, we don't start from scratch. There are a lot of security technologies that are already in place and can be used in the context of privacy, privacy-enhancing technologies, as we call them, PETs. And here, again, I'm giving you only a few examples of this type of technologies. For example, we can have techniques that can help us learn on encrypted data, which is an important step towards safeguarding confidentiality of data and still being able to conduct analysis on data. Or also there are different types of techniques to perform, for example, anonymization. It's not necessarily anonymization, and I believe we'll hear about that later on, but anonymization does not necessarily mean that we need to have a pool of data and take the identifiers out. There are other ways of doing anonymization, like, for example, systems that are based on queries and answers, like differential privacy systems, and so on. I don't want to become too technical in this presentation, but also as a last point, all this area of transparency and control mechanisms is also very important. Tools that can support towards, for example, consent mechanisms, as Despina was saying before, or tools that can give users control, they can give them choice. There are several technologies out there. The question is how we use them, and in order to use them, we need to think about that. We need to think privacy. So this will take me back to my first slide. As a final point, are we there yet? Obviously, we're not. But again, as I said in the beginning, I believe that the first step is a change of mind. I don't think that in many instances, privacy is at the heart of the design. We actually see exactly the opposite. We have seen actually reports which show that several companies, amongst the big ones that you can imagine, create design in a way that is actually nudging users towards privacy-invasive behavior rather than privacy-friendly behavior. And we also see in several other analyses that in practice, privacy is really not a concern at all at the design phase of systems and services. So the first step is to change the change of mind. And then, of course, we need more research. The Commission has already projects in this area. We need more projects, I think. We need also more best practices. We need tools. We need real implementation solutions. And there is a lot of work to be done here. But also, as I said, there are already tools available. It is possible to start from somewhere. And last but not least, and so as to maybe also like that pass the floor to the next speaker, perhaps it's also important to consider broadening the scope. We have been speaking about privacy all this time, but of course there are other human rights that are also challenged in the era of big data, and there is a greater ethical, let's say, discussion here, which also perhaps is the next step to take. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Athena. Thank you, Athena. I would like to open the floor in case there are questions or comments already on the sessions we've had until now. Yes, please, and if you can identify who you are when you take the floor.
Yes, Rüdiger Martin from DG Connect, working on spectrum policy. I was wondering, that was a very interesting presentation on privacy by design and to understand the principles. But I was just wondering, isn't there a bit of a contradiction to what companies are doing and will be willing and probably will want to do still for a very, very long time? And do you think it is really possible to, let's say, force, and I'm really willingly using the word force, a company like Google to converge to something like that?
Yes, thank you for the question. Of course, there is a contradiction. There's obviously a contradiction. And it's not only Google, it's also smaller companies that are doing the same. For example, we had a study some years ago on privacy by design in mobile apps. And we saw that in most of the cases, apps, for example, are using data just because they were designed like that without even having thought of how to use this data. So obviously, it's not there. Can we enforce it? I believe that we can, yes. First of all, there is a legal obligation for data protection by design right now in GDPR for data controllers, of course. This does not touch upon designers. But however, since data controllers have this obligation, let's say implicitly, this also may impact these third parties. So I believe that enforcement needs to come from the regulators. I believe that this is the first step. It needs to come. We have an obligation, it needs to be enforced, obviously. And I would also like to say that in the Commission's proposal for the privacy regulation, there was also an obligation for the designers of communication software for privacy. Actually, not exactly privacy by design, but it was an obligation at least to inform. I don't know if this is going to stay at the end or not, but there are, what I want to say is that there are legal tools to enforce right now. So the question is, are the regulators going to use them? This is the question, and I cannot answer that because I'm not a regulator, but I believe that enforcement works when it happens, and we certainly do have a strong requirement in GDPR for that, in my opinion.
Thank you, Athena. Other questions or comments from colleagues? So I think we can stimulate also more discussion the more presentations we have, and I would like to now pass the floor to Ljubica Pendarovska, who is one of our ethics expert and data protection officers in the Horizon 2020 Repast project. It's one of the projects, but of course, Mrs. Pendarovska has extensive experience in the area of data protection and privacy through various positions, including at UNICEF, if I'm not mistaken, in Europe and Central Asia. She was chairperson and ethical data protection expert for a number of Horizon 2020 projects, but also for the EU, NATO, and OECD projects, in particular on data protection and the media. So she brings us a lot of expertise, and she will focus exactly on this topic, ethics. So ethics, instead of simple compliance, to make the difference in privacy as a top digital priority. So indeed, ethics is the word. Our experts on artificial intelligence in another room are discussing also that. Very important value in Europe. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. At the beginning, allow me please to express my gratitude to the European Commission and to the Connect University for giving me the opportunity to share with all of you some of my thoughts related to privacy and personal data protection, but from other point of view as a human right. That's why we are going to discuss a lot about ethics, something which is a kind of forgotten things nowadays. When I came in the building, I made a joke that it's the first time for me to get in the same building after so many times being here as a speaker, because in different occasions I was here as a part of our team of my country, North Macedonia, for accession to the European Union. So nowadays you're very famous, but today I'm going to talk as an expert for privacy in digital age. When I was thinking about what is the best approach to start the conversation today, since I think that the ethics dimension of privacy is a very important thing to discuss, not only among the representatives of different institutions, but also among individuals, because at the end of the day, when we all came back home from work, we are all individuals subject of our privacy and our personal data. I came to the conclusion, as always, that the different angle and different perspective or different role in which we act in a concrete situation gives us the different view of the privacy, and it makes us to undertake different activities. So let's start with the roots. First of all, to start with the definition of privacy, but not, to be honest, not the definition as a legal term, but the definition, the privacy, what does it mean in its core, inside, in the essence of privacy? The first problem arises here. The definition of privacy is mutable, and also it changes through the times. It also differs, the privacy, it has different meaning for people living in Europe. As you mentioned, we want to be Europe to become a champion in privacy, and from my perspective, I think that it's not hard to be nowadays a champion, since having in mind privacy politics from other continents. It changes through time, but also it has a different meaning for people living here and people living in the United States. We all know, I will give an example. The first problem is trading with personal data. Although in the European borders, the European Union, it is not allowed. We don't have that kind of sellers or buyers of legally one, which are buying and selling personal data for some purposes, but it's the different situation in the United States. And now we are coming to the problem. We are discussing about digital age, which has the digital world, online world, which has no boundaries. So that's the problem, the first problem, how to define, first of all, the privacy, because the privacy that our parents or even our grandparents had no longer exists. And what are the major factors that contribute to the privacy problem in digital space? The first one, it's an open space. It has a non-deterministic nature. Digital space has no non-deterministic nature. And the second major factor is the complex information of many web-based transactions involving transfer of personal data. But here we are talking about how to protect privacy. At the end of the day, we should first uninstall the fear, because for us, which are dealing with privacy, and for those which are creating privacy policies, the first instance should be how to make it possible, the privacy to coexist at the same time with the research processes, which is, believe me, in a digital in the digital space and in the digital age, very tricky one. I'm working as you mentioned, Despina, I'm working on different projects. And that's why where I can see the other dimension, what privacy really means. We are facing with the situation, not only we as humans, as individuals don't know what privacy really means and what are our rights arising from our right to privacy and personal data protection, but also universities, which are standing as leaders behind those huge millions projects, are not even aware what are their obligations concerning, for instance, data ethics and data protection officers when it comes to such a huge projects. Even in this research process, I have several cases where the researchers are faced with so many challenges, what to do with personal data they are collecting for research purposes. At the end, they are not even aware, are they on the right line, or maybe they are violating some privacy of some of those people which are involved in the research process. So let's uninstall the fear, but keep the caution. That's the most important thing nowadays. Which are the challenges to the right to privacy, not detected for 2019, but maybe some predictions for the near future, because it's very hard to predict what will happen. And basically one of the questions here is it possible, we are talking about regulations, we are talking about directives, but let's face the reality. The biggest success in the area of personal data protection, the General Data Protection Regulation, happened after so many years of discussion and negotiations, which means while we are discussing about rules, someone on the ground is doing other things which we cannot follow. So the main question is, are the human rights and measures for protection of human rights capable to follow what's happening in technology, what's happening in the information system exchange? So what are the challenges to the right to privacy? First of all, mass surveillance. If a few years ago, we could mostly discuss about surveillance state, which means surveillance activities coming from states and through their institutions. Nowadays, we are not sure what we mean really when we say surveillance, because we are faced with a mass surveillance, not only coming from the states and their institutions, but from other corporations, there are some corporations which are even doing bigger surveillance than the state itself, because of the money, of course. Then the government hacking, the intelligence sharing, the biometric technologies is a very important and one of the core areas which are still undercovered with under some fog, because most of the people, first of all, are not aware and clear what a biometric technology really means and how their biometric data could be used in some specific period of time or in some situation. Then profiling was mentioned, scoring and ranking of individuals. I would add here not only that the profiling and scoring or ranking of the individuals is important seen from a perspective of privacy or personal data protection, but it undermines at the same time the democracy rules and the democratic system. Not that long ago it happened with the Cambridge Analytica firm, and now there are a lot of discussions, is it on the line of democracy and election systems? Business surveillance, it is covered and it goes in the same line with mass surveillance. It's part of the mass surveillance, but it is purposely put aside because business surveillance is something that big corporations, especially search engines, social media sites and internet sites are doing for their business purposes and for making even more money than they made. Now we are coming to we mentioned privacy by design, and it's a very interesting system. I agree that it's very important, but we didn't mention privacy by default. And from my perspective, when we are talking about general data protection regulation, especially in digital sphere, it was the first crucial step which gives the first results in practice in protecting privacy of individuals on social media. Because it made the social media under pressure to make them, at the beginning, to give the highest possible protection of their users in online world. And here I will say a few words about e-privacy regulation. From my perspective, I think that I'm not sure whether one more regulation will make a big difference. I don't think so, and I'm in the line of those which are discussing that whether it is happening in offline world or it's happening in online world, no matter the device, the environment, it is the same. Athena mentioned the principles. She shared with us the principles of data protection, which are embedded in the GDPR. But, and yes, they are what's my point is that they are the same, whether we are talking, the same rules are, whether we are talking about activities happening online or offline. So that's why I don't think so that we should that way give an impression that something different should happen online. No, it's the same. The environment is different, but that doesn't mean that different rules or different principles apply. The Internet of Things was mentioned, and also here also I'm not sure whether what Internet of Things really means something for privacy of ordinary people. People are not even aware how, for instance, connected things in their home environment are connected with their privacy. They are not aware that systems, for instance, which are in their homes and showing who is when their children are coming back from school, so they can see from for security reasons, it is a kind of privacy matter. They don't see that way. So that comes to the basis that the first question is awareness. And it is of each individual responsibility for his own privacy and for privacy of the others. But at the same time, it is the responsibility of state actors, other multinational groups, fighters for human rights, policymakers, to fight for biggest responsibility of all actors which are included in this game. There are a lot of multinational efforts to protect privacy, also business efforts to protect privacy, because each effective online business realized the importance of customer trust, and I sincerely hope so that the number of businesses, the number of companies will grow which are putting the privacy, the customer trust at first, and not at the end of the story. And they will often provide their users with data protection and transparency about how they collect and use data. It's very important I always want to see the privacy from the social aspect as human being, and that's why I'm involving ethics. Although I don't mention it as an ethics, but I'm talking all the time about ethics. And from that perspective, it is, when I talk with people in different occasions and in different projects about privacy, what does it matter the most? They say, it's important for us to know. Although there are a lot of cases when people are trading their security, their privacy for convenience, for get something which is in that situation more important for them. But for people, it's important to know what is happening, because that it gives them a kind of expression that they have a kind of control of the situation. As I said, General Data Protection Regulation was very important because it finally, in the first month when it was enacted and get in practice, it puts the biggest social media and search sites as Google and Facebook. They were imposed on a huge fines, although it might not mean a lot in money for those giants. But if it is case by case, and that's one of the most important things that the awareness should give to the people, that they have a mechanism how to fight for their rights. Which means if we have, for instance, one case in which the National Data Protection Authority imposed some fine of some social media, then by definition, by default, all other similar cases which individuals will raise in front of the institution, the relevant institutions, is going to have the same end result. I'm not going to share the results about the fines. And what's very important, there was 1 or 2 months ago, I'm not sure, Eurobarometer did some research talking about privacy concern and awareness of people. The majority of Europeans does make use of their right to change privacy settings. It's happening after the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. On the question, have you ever tried to change the privacy settings of your personal profile from the default settings on an online social network? And 27,000 Europeans were asked about their social media habits. More than most of people, 56% answered that yes, they changed the privacy settings, but still, more than 43% said that they did nothing about it, which means people are not that much, although they are not that much interested, although they believe the social media networks, although they are not aware about such thing. It is another question that privacy policies of social media are so complex, and which knows more than average person related to privacy, I'm very confused when I get in privacy policies of social media, because it goes from one step to another and then you're totally lost and you can't control your social media. And the second question, why have you not tried to change the privacy settings of your personal profiles? The biggest, 27% said that they trust the sites to set appropriate privacy settings. 27% they don't know how to do this. And 20% they are not worried about sharing their personal data. So think about whether we as individuals are undertaking responsible activities towards our own privacy. And finally, I will get to the digital ethics. Digital ethics is a kind of field of study. It is under construction, I would say, because it is something new. We discussed with Athena before we get in the room about data protection officers, and I'm very happy that although Horizon 2020 projects are not obliged to have DPOs, they are still more and more every day interested to have ethics experts and DPOs, because they see what someone that built the project, that constructed the project, couldn't see at the very beginning, because they are facing with the real problems in real time. So I hope so that this, as a part of digital ethics, is going to be better and growing each day. Digital ethics as a field of study is concerned with the way technology is shaping and will shape our political, social, and moral existence. Why? Because I mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of differences and incompatibilities how we see privacy in business or in state relations between citizens coming from different states or different continents. And that's why we need digital ethics. Because in the basis, the ethics should be somehow common thing. And I wanted to talk something about artificial intelligence and digital ethics, but it was mentioned a few times, and I will stop here with one conclusion at the end, which gives us right to believe that better days for privacy are coming. We'll see that. But why I'm saying that? Because for the first time this year, it happened that one of the leading analyzed firms in the world included the digital privacy and ethics at the top list for strategic technology trends for 2019, which is for the first time when we are talking about technology trends. And at the end of the discussion, I hope that the Europe at least, because we'll see how it will happen in the other part of the world, Europe will become champion in privacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Pendarowska. Despina Spanu had to leave for the press conference for the Cybersecurity Act, so she asked me to take over the moderation. I'm Peter Eberl. I'm Deputy Head of Unit of the unit dealing with cybersecurity and digital privacy. And I open the floor for questions to Mrs. Pendarowska. No questions? Then I have one. You said that the definition of privacy depends on the situation of people geographically, but also, I understood also, depending on the concrete situation, maybe the daytime, and so on. On the other hand, we have privacy laws, and they should apply in the same way to everybody. Do you think the definition of privacy in your general way, beyond the legal term, could or should be different within the EU, or should it be the same within the EU because we have a common legal framework for that? And the definition, let's say I think you call it the mutual definition, applies rather cross continents when we have different legal systems and in order to have a common understanding on what is privacy across legal systems.
Thank you for your question. Seen from European Union perspective, I think that it's a good idea since we are in one place all together, and it's much convenient and it's much easier for everything, not only for everyday communication of people, but also for doing business, for exchanging goods, services, etc. It's the best to have the common sense, the common view of what a privacy really means. Although, as I said, when you have in mind the world in whole, we'll have some challenges discussing about privacy, especially about the definition of privacy, especially if we have in mind, for instance, US, where the privacy really means something, in some cases, something different. But let's try to kind of impose, as we do with the General Data Protection Regulation to other parts of the world, to build a kind of common sense of what the privacy really means.
And maybe another question on what you mentioned, the digital ethics. How do you think is that enforceable? Because that's a general challenge of the ethics also in the artificial intelligence context, but how do you see that? I think it's a very interesting approach to say there should be digital ethics and also on how privacy should be understood in the US, in the EU, in Asia. But how can you, can those common views be enforced?
Well, it's another interesting question, and I'm not sure whether I have the right answer. Privacy by design and privacy by default is one of the measures that we undertake to build a kind of digital ethics, because it is always questionable whether we should first impose rules which are concerning privacy by design and privacy by default are touching the ethics concerns. Actually, in their essence, they are ethics measures. And that's the way how we can embed it, how we can build the ethics, although ethics should come from within the businesses and from within the people. It should be inherent to our nature, but since the reality and practice have shown in many cases that it's not like that. When people and businesses are led by money, then the different rules all apply. But those measures embedded in general data protection regulation, and I hope so there will be some changes in the general data protection regulation, which will make it even much better, improved in some, from some practical aspects. Those are the measures how to implement digital ethics coming from the back door.
Can I say something? Of course. Sorry, just want to. Sorry. Data protection by design and by default are legal obligations. They're in GDPR. They can, of course, I understand they can, based on that, you can build ethical principles. They are law.
Yes, they are
it's law. Based on this law, they can be enforced. And actually, you very rightly mentioned the data protection by default. This is also a very powerful legal obligation, and it's actually one of those obligations in GDPR that are not, let's say, that are absolute. There is not any prerequisite to apply them. They're absolute obligations. The data controller needs to take, has to protect data protection by default. Does this happen? We had the question before that. Obviously not in practice, but it's a legal obligation. And I would like to make this clear, because I very much support the discussion on ethics, but I think we should not forget that we also have law, and it's much more powerful, and it can help us at least start from somewhere. Because we had law also before, by the way, we don't start from scratch, but we have also a more powerful law today. And I think we should not forget that, and we should not confuse it.
Has this discussion triggered any new questions to the two first speakers? Yes.
Yes, Flora Frederiks, cybersecurity unit in DG Connect. A question maybe for ENISA is that I was last week at a conference on cybersecurity, and someone walking in on cybersecurity solutions was giving a presentation. And he says, today, one of the fast-growing cyber attacks is phishing, phishing mails, phishing context-sensitive advertisements. How could we ever fight this if we cannot analyze the data? I mean, Google claims that they have 99.999% of phishing emails out, spam emails getting out, because they have access to the data. They don't care about the GDPR. So if we want to have cybersecurity in the future, I think it will be more and more a challenge. If you cannot inspect the data, the cyber criminal will not look about privacy concerns. But those fighting, those trying to make the cybersecurity, the internet more cyber secure, they have not the same weapons. And I think it's a specific question for ENISA.
Yes, thank you for this question. Of course, we need to analyze the data, but we have to do it in the right way. This was the point I wanted to make in my presentation. And GDPR or privacy, all the regulations that we have, are not against innovation, and they're not against cybersecurity at all. Actually, in GDPR, there is an exception for the use of data for cybersecurity reasons. So of course, we will analyze data. We will use data to do the analysis. The question is how you do it. And the fact that we need to analyze data does not mean that we will take all data, make a huge database, identify everybody. This is excessive. There are ways to do it. The question is whether we want to invest in these ways. This is different. And of course, because this takes time, it takes money, it needs changes in the way that the ecosystem works in several instances, especially if we're talking about big online companies like Google, as you mentioned, but that's another issue. It is possible to do it. There are ways to do it. There are privacy-enhancing technologies that can support analysis in a way that is privacy-friendly. And I believe that this is the real challenge in practice. And why isn't this happening? Because there is a lot of force against it. But then this is our challenge for the future, in my opinion. Because I also believe, and I am a cybersecurity expert, I work for ENISA, I believe that there is no point in investing in cybersecurity if we cannot protect our fundamental values. We cannot solve a problem with creating another one. It's not going to be the solution at the end. I think this is the whole challenge today.
Yes, I mean, okay, I do agree. I mean, I am just repeating a question. And the question is very, I think, to the point, because today you see all this virus and cyber attacks being transforming all the time. The only things that you have to know that something could be a virus or an infection is the IP addresses they go back to or the URLs. But this is private data. Now, ENISA is producing so many reports. Why don't they produce a report how to handle personal data in cybersecurity? I mean, this is what we need. Because like you're saying, there are ways around. But if you ask someone in the field, no one knows what the ways around are. And therefore, I think the cybersecurity business as a solution providers will leave Europe, if they can.
Yes, certainly. That just to say that an ENISA is not a regulator. We are not there to say what is the legal basis for using data and so on, or interpreting GDPR. This is not our role. But we can work on technology, and we're doing that. Certainly there is room for improvement there. There is room for a lot of work. I would fully agree on that. But again, I think my point is that protecting privacy is not against cybersecurity and should not be. And I don't think this is the intention of the General Data Protection Regulation either.
Any other questions on the topics we have discussed so far? Maybe just one comment on this very interesting discussion. I think we also have this discussion in the e-privacy debate, and there is an explicit exception now in the proposal of the Commission and also in the Council and Parliament's text that personal or communications data may be processed for the purpose of ensuring the security of the network and the services. I think the concern which needs to be addressed and which is done in the GDPR and in the e-privacy proposal is that for instance, Google or any other company who processes communications data or personal data for the purpose of enhancing security does not use this data for other purposes. It must be made sure that it is only used for the purpose of ensuring security and for nothing else. And it must also be that it is not a kind of mass processing. I think if Google started saying, I need to process each and every traffic which I get into my network or into my email service, I think that would probably go too far. But if there is a suspicion that something is corrupted or is malware, I think then there's no absolute protection of personal data or of communications data. I think if somebody uses, or if an individual does some criminal acts, there is no, let's say the fact that there is a personal data, for instance, his IP address, does not protect him from prosecution. I think that is obvious, and I think that is also I'm not sure there is already guidance from the EDPB, which is probably the right body to give such guidance. But I'm sure that national data protection authorities are working on that and also creating guidance or decision practice how this can be enforced in the GDPR, and the same will happen in the e-privacy regulation. Okay, now let me introduce our third speaker. It's I hope I pronounce it correctly, Fasaneh Ali. He used to work as a particle physicist at CMS at CERN. Currently, he's a PhD student at Imperial College in London, and his research focuses on quantifying the impact of algorithmic decision-making on society. So very interesting. He empirically studies the effect of the personalization tools used to leverage such behavioral data sets on society. A second area of interest is the study of the limits of privacy in large data sets. And today he will talk about the limits of anonymization and the future of privacy. And I think he will introduce this topic himself.
Yeah, thanks a lot. If it's okay, I'll stand because I'm not sure if this thing's range will work through all the people. So thanks a lot for the previous speakers, Athena and Lubica, to highlight the current challenges in privacy. And thanks for the school and the university for inviting us here to have this session. So I'm Ali, and as it was mentioned, I'm a PhD student at Imperial. I'm going to be talking to you about the limits of anonymization and the future of privacy. Now, this is the research that we do in our group at the Computational Privacy Group, as well as the research that I'm personally involved in. I know that today and throughout the whole session, you've been hearing a lot about privacy, so I'll try to make this a little bit more entertaining than usual. So yeah, let's go. So, this morning, when I woke up, I took out my phone, I browsed Reddit, and I looked at a few posts. I browsed online a little bit more, made a few calls, went down, got a coffee, and then came here, maybe paid for a couple other stuff, made a few more calls, etc., etc. And, I do this every day. So, when I make payments, there's data that looks like what is on your screens right now, that is recorded by the credit card company. And then every time I make a call, every time I browse the internet, there's some information being recorded about me. Every single link I click on, everything I search for. And lastly, every time I make a call, who I call, where I was when I called, when I called, all of that is being recorded somewhere, usually for a very long time. Okay, so this data is super useful. You can do lots of stuff with it, and it's also sensitive. So this kind of data has given birth to a whole new field of science called computational social science, where you can use the digital traces that you're leaving behind in order to figure out new stuff about our behavior as a society. It's also changing the way that hospitals work. It's changing the way how we discover medicine. And in business, it has impact on a very broad category of things. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are lots of other applications. For example, in fashion, in art, in trading, in sports, in law, in how we date and how we listen to music. It's everywhere. You'd be hard-pressed to find an area where all this new data is not really transformative. Okay, so let's go back to what we saw before. So if we look at my credit card history, you'd be able to figure out if I'm buying, Gucci belts and bags all over the place, or if I'm buying super cheap stuff all the time. So you can figure out my income, and you can figure out maybe where I live because of the location. From the web searches that I do, you can figure out what keywords I search for. You can probably figure out my sexual orientation. You can figure out what political beliefs I have and what I'm interested in. And from who I call, you can figure out what my social network is, and also where I am when I make those calls. You can probably figure out where I live. You can probably figure out where I work. This is all sensitive information. Okay, so we know it's super useful. We've been talking about that throughout this whole, session. But it's also private. So how have we been using it so far? Well, the standard tool for protecting privacy has been anonymization. So I'm going to give you a little intro on what that might look like. Say I have a data set that looks something like this, and I'm interested in the yearly income of the rich. And I can't use this data to figure that out because it's got people's names in it, it's got people's incomes in it. I could never get consent for these people to do this, especially if I want to like share it with interns and students. So what we do as a first stage is we take the names and replace them with random identifiers. So I've pseudonymized it now. So now some people would say, okay, maybe this is protected, but obviously if we look back before we had Catherine's birthday was in the year 1936. So if I know that, that still makes her unique here. Okay, so what now? Well, maybe you'd say I don't really need to know exactly when her birthday was, so I'd add a bit of noise to that column. And now this data set is something we call too anonymous, and this has been one of the standards that we had used for a long time. And now you could use this. However, one thing to remember is that once a dataset is considered anonymous, data protection regulation no longer applies. I can now share this with anyone I want. I can give it to anyone to do any research I want, unless there are limits in how I obtain the data. Okay, so we've seen this, but does this work with the other kind of data that we saw, with the credit card data or the web histories or the phone calls? Well, in order to understand that, let's think about fingerprints for a moment. So fingerprints are national identifiers. And to identify someone, you'd require 12 points from their fingerprint. And these red dots, what they represent here are the distances between the ridges on 12 different locations on your finger. And if you have that about someone, then you can probably uniquely identify them with a high probability. So if the distances between ridges on your finger are what you need to re-identify someone with their fingerprint, how many points do you need to re-identify someone in a modern high-dimensional data set? So, and what are points anyway in that context? Okay, so let's take the credit card example again. Let's say that the shop that you visit and the date together would constitute 1 point. Okay, so for example, in this anonymized data set, we'd say for that particular customer, Border Cafe on the 24th of September is 1 point. Okay, so now that we know what a point might look like, how many of these would we need to re-identify someone? Like we had 12 for fingerprints, and how many do we need in this kind of data? Well, 4 points. So what does that mean? We took credit card data from a European country, and the data contained the histories of 1.1 million people collected over 3 months. So this is 3 months of, for example, me going around and buying stuff with my card. And then considering what points are, so shop and date, we found that on average, with 4 points, 90% of the people become unique. So what does that mean? So say you have my entire trajectory, but you don't know who it is, you don't have my name, and it's a bit noisy as well. And you pick 4 random points from that trajectory, and then you look at the whole data set to see who else has those 4 points like me. Who else has shopped at Urban Outfitters on the 24th of September, and blah, and blah, and blah. And you find that 90% of the time, it's just me, there's no one else. Once you have that, then you have the whole trace, because once you know those 4 points, if you know that I've been shopping at specific places like 3-4 times, and you go into this data set, then you have the whole trace. You know all the other places where I spent money. Maybe I went to a strip club somewhere. Maybe I went and bought something weird or whatever. And besides that, you also would know all the places that I've been. You know my location. And one thing to remember is that this data set was anonymized. This data set had only a resolution of 1 day for your transactions, and it was per shop. It's 1.1 million people. That's almost a population of some countries. Okay, so you might say, okay, well that's good and well, but where do you find these points anyway? How could you find out where I bought what on what day? Well, turns out we leave these things everywhere. For example, if you went and searched for me, you'd find that I'm just giving that location away on Facebook or on Twitter. The other stuff that you could do is that if you have a targeted attack, you might know some information already. Like if I'm interested in finding my, say, colleagues, I know their place of work. I probably know where they live. And then through this data set, I might know lots of other stuff about them as well. And lastly, if you're really being nefarious, then you could actually just like bump into someone or follow them around for maybe, 1 day. And then once you have that, you'll have the 4 points and you can go find them. Okay, so this is not the only time, this is not the only example of this happening. In the past, anonymous movie ratings data that was mentioned by Athena earlier has been re-identified. Anonymous apps on our phones, so the apps on our phones, what list of apps you have, that has been re-identified. Location data has been identified numerous times, from credit cards, which I gave you an example of, to mobile phones, to public transport data, to GPS, and also the taxis that was mentioned earlier. Lastly, medical data has also been re-identified before in a very famous case in the early 2000s. And there are also lots of other examples. These are just the ones that have been published in high-impact journals that I've included here. Okay, so say you have this anonymous data and you manage to re-identify someone. Is it only their location that you can find out from that? Oh, well, before that, one thing that I should mention is that anonymization doesn't always work for privacy. New data sets are often high dimensional, which means that for one individual, you would have thousands of different points. You visit thousands of websites in a couple of months. You buy thousands of things. You make lots and lots of calls. This means that each of us in those data sets is very, very unique. So by just knowing a few of the points from that trajectory, that entire trajectory becomes unique in the data set. You can then re-identify them. And anonymization is less and less effective against this kind of set intersection attack. Okay, so say you have one of these data sets and you have found someone. What else can you find out? You just know their location, what they bought is maybe you would consider maybe that is sensitive, but it's not super sensitive. Okay, well, in fact, you can do lots of stuff with data analytics and machine learning techniques. You can predict personality traits. You can predict people's gender and age quite well. You can predict their income levels quite well from just mobile phone metadata, this one. So this is when you call, how often you call, where you live, stuff like that. You can discover political beliefs if you know what movies people are watching or what ratings they're giving. And one example that I think is quite interesting is, so the Netflix movie ratings data set is about a case where Netflix published 500,000 customers' movie ratings information about over a course of a few months, I think. And in this data set, you had what movie you'd watched, when you watched it, and what rating you gave it. And they wanted to do it again after the first time. But there was a lawsuit by an in-the-closet lesbian mother that was afraid that she would be outed, even though the data set was anonymized. And the reason for this is that, as we saw, it's re-identifiable. If I were her husband, I could very easily download the data set and figure out what movies we watched together in that month, and then see, oh wait, what are all these other stuff? And then that would maybe trigger an uncomfortable conversation that she wouldn't want triggered from some weird company publishing data about her. Okay, so what can we do? And as Athena said, the solution is privacy-enhancing technologies. So in the past, what we were doing is that we'd start off with a data set, with a database, and then we'd anonymize it. And then say you'd add some noise in places, you made sure it's 2 or 3 or 5 anonymous, you remove names, identifiers, and maybe just insert some fake users. Lots of tricks that exist in the field for this. Then what we would do is we would publish this somewhere. We would put it on a platform, usually online, and usually once it goes online, you can't unpublish it. It's there forever. And then the researchers or whoever is interested would go and download it and do whatever they wanted, like they would calculate the yearly income of the rich. Even if today we did this and it's safe today, there's no guarantee that in 5 years, 10 years' time, some whiz kid doesn't come up with an amazing algorithm that can predict various different things from that same data. And we all know that we wouldn't want, right? Okay. We all know that we wouldn't want our health data to be made public if we knew that, for example, you could be re-identified, and then from that, that information could be given to your insurer. Now, I'm going to go and try and fix what's happened on your screens. Take a break. I'll be right back. Enjoyed that break. All right. Okay, so how can we change this paradigm? Well, first of all, consider that the only place where privacy protection is done in this old style of publishing data, and when I say old, I mean like now. has been in the anonymization section. Okay, so what can we do? One solution, as an example, is a query-based system, which has been mentioned before. In this case, that same person who's interested in the data would send the query into the database. And then the database would look at what the query is, compute the true answer, but before giving the answer out, they might add some noise, right? And then they would give that answer back. And in this case, the privacy protection is happening in this noise addition process. So on the face of it, maybe it doesn't look that different, but consider that now this system can choose what type of noise to add to which queries, can choose not to respond to certain queries, can choose to change the kind of noise over time, and also not to give access to certain people. It has a lot more control than just publishing data online and hoping that nobody will figure stuff out from it in the future. And by the way, that nobody could be people like me who take credit card data and re-identify it, right? So it can be done. It's not super hard. Okay, so we've seen what this looks like, and we maybe have seen some examples of it in the wild, but are there any like full-fledged versions where you can use data for good using a system like this? And the answer to that is yes. There's a platform called Opal that is being developed by us in collaboration with colleagues from MIT, from Orange, the World Economic Forum, and Datapop Alliance. And what is Opal? It's the Open Algorithms platform. It's a query-based system, basically. And it's currently deployed in Senegal using the data of close to 10 million people. That's almost the entire country. And this can be used for many good applications, such as national statistics that the Senegalese government don't have ready access to, and they could use for many different purposes, such as where should we build the next hospital. So what makes this different than before? I'm just going to highlight a few points. First is that the set of queries is limited. You can't just put in a bit of code on your machine and then submit it. There are a set of queries that are pre-approved that you have to use. Next, those queries are designed to be privacy preserving by the experts in the field as well as on the ground in conjunction with the national statistics offices and data protection officers. The queries are logged, so even if all these people don't realize what's happening, say I want to like mess with the system and I keep submitting queries to try and extract the whole data set, that will be seen and caught before it's possible. And lastly, the code is open source. So if you wanted to design your own query, you could submit an issue and then you'd put the code up and then the people would look at it and figure out if that's okay. And if it's okay, it would become part of the limited set of queries. And this is just a taste of what's there. There are many other protective layers on top of this. And this kind of approach is the future of how we should protect the kind of data that we've been looking at today. So if there are any takeaways, these are the 3 key takeaways that I'd want you to take with you. First, data protection regulation does not apply to anonymized data. So think about that. We often forget that, yes, GDPR is great, but it doesn't apply to the data set that we looked at today, like the credit card data. Next, anonymization is ineffective for modern big data sets. We need to rethink the wording we put in policies when we say something needs to be anonymized. We have to say specifically it has to be, for example, from a query-based system, that. We need to be a bit more specific. And I know there's pushback because if you're specific, then you can get outdated quickly, but we need to find a balance here. And lastly, privacy-enhancing technologies are the future of privacy protection, and we need to invest in that. And yes, it's slow, it's research, but it's going to be worth it for not only the next generations, but also our generation. And thank you very much for your time, and this is our group.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting and entertaining presentation. I'm sure there are plenty of questions now.
Hello, good morning. I'm Agustin Diaz from the Electronic Communications Unit from DG Connect. I found your presentation very interesting, and I've already read some articles, especially dedicated to the telecom operators and how to anonymize those data. And well, some of them are claiming, yeah, that's what we need to be able to compete with Netflix or Google and Facebook. Could you give us a bit more flavor of what you just explained, these anonymization tools apply to telecom operators' data?
Yes, thanks. So the question is, how does this apply to, I'm going to say, other kinds of data and not just mobile phones? And the answer to that is you have to build specific queries for those specific applications. it's nice to think that we might have a general purpose tool, but no. Because the application space is so heterogeneous, you need specific queries, for example, for telecommunications data. Why do you want access to telecommunications data? For example, say I want to make sure that my servers are always online when I'm about. And maybe I'm a student that I'm interested in how that works, so I want that data. So in that case, then there would be a query that gives me aggregated information about that when I make it. But publishing the data and then extracting that ourselves is a risky behavior.
Other questions? Yes.
It's not exactly a question. What I wanted to comment in this very interesting presentation is that, in fact, many of the data sets that you showed in the beginning, I would say they would be characterized as pseudonymized data under GDPR, not anonymized data. And this is a very important distinction. And I think that very often, exactly as you told us, companies think that or not only companies, also public authorities, they think that just because they took away some direct identifiers, like those that you saw, the name, the age, or that they generalize this information, it's enough, and then that data is anonymous, and then they forget that, of course, this data, if combined with others, they can always reveal. So that's why I think also in GDPR, we do have also now the notion of pseudonymization. It is quoted as a security measure and as a privacy by design measure in GDPR. And then, of course, this can be used as a safeguard for the controller, like a telecom operator, to protect the data when they are processed. But, of course, when they are shared with third parties, it needs to be consider that it's still personal data. It's not anonymized. You cannot consider it as anonymized.
Yeah, so this is true in some sense. Yes, pseudonymized data is when you take a data set and remove direct identifiers. And to my understanding, the way that a data controller decides that a data set is anonymous is internal. They don't, there is no standard, there's no gold standard that you have to abide by. If the data controller thinks that that data set is not going to be re-identified, then they're going to say that, okay, we think this is anonymous. And in the case of the credit card data and lots of other data sets, those were considered anonymous at the time. And this was in 2013. So yes, maybe we can say that that's pseudonymized today because we can see how easy it is to re-identify it. But this is, I think, an after-the-fact analysis rather than a predictive one. Yeah.
Yes, Rafael.
I would be interested and curious about OPAL, this initiative. So maybe a couple of questions would be, which are your current target audience in terms of end users submitting queries? My second question would be, how do you envisage the, I don't know how to call this, the governance? For example, let me be precise. You said there will be possibility to change the noise, to increase the noise. Well, who will decide this kind of decisions?
Yes, thanks. So the questions are, one, in OPAL, who's the target audience? And the answer to that is, given that it's an open source platform, well, it's an open source platform, but anybody can submit queries on the face of it. But the targets that we're interested in are national statistics organizations that want to use this personal data of the citizenry. And second is researchers, people who, if anybody is in research here, you would know what a nightmare it is to try and get data like this, which is almost individual level data for a particular application that you're interested in. And in the case of OPAL, you can get the information that you would eventually get out of the individual level data through this aggregation process. And this leads to the second question, which is who decides what levels of noise, what sorts of privacy protection we put in. I've simplified a little bit in my presentation, but the levels of noise are decided based on a couple of different principles. One is penetrate and patch, which is basically based on experience, and it changes over time. And the other one is based on theoretical guarantees, depending on the query that is being submitted. And these theoretical guarantees could come from a field called differential privacy, which gives you a particular guarantee when you add a certain level of noise. And a budget. So a particular query can only be made a certain number of times. After that, it is no longer guaranteed that it is safe. And these levels are decided by consulting both with the data controller, the National Statistics Organization, and the researchers.
Many thanks for your presentation. I have two questions about your approach for ensuring real anonymity of the data. First of all, assuming that the queries on your data on the database are legitimate, even if I fully understand the addition of noise and also selecting in case the result the system might be there, but it could not affect, I would say, the quality of the researches having creating the query itself, because we could assume that the same query might have different answers to different research group, and therefore always assuming that they are legitimate, but having to the same question different answers, and therefore having an issue on the science, I would say. The second question, I would say it is more mathematical, about the noise, because doing a parallelism with the GPS system, where the Americans added to the signal a lot of noise in order to lower the resolution, using a statistical method, it is have practically on the same original signal, but now having a resolution more or less like the military one of the GPS, or coming to a meter, also very good for civilian use. Do you think that it would be possible also in future have that some refinement of statistical method, that also on that system it was possible to eliminate the added noise on the queries?
Yes, thanks for your questions. So the first one is, how does this noise that is being added, that is different from query to query, going to impact the science? Are all the scientists going to get the same result, basically? And the answer to that is that the noise is dependent not only on the query, but also on how many queries have been asked, and various different aspects like this. I will contrast the levels of noise that would be added here with what is being done at the moment. At the moment, if today, after all of this, new interest in privacy, somebody wanted to publish mobile phone data, they would add a lot of noise. They would take, for example, every antenna, which covers a square kilometer, and they would aggregate it to maybe 5 or 6 different antennas, depending on how popular that area is. So that would be a very big area, so maybe 10, 15 kilometers large. And they would also aggregate the time a lot. We don't do that, because what Opal does is that you would submit a query to say, for example, how many people are in the commission area today, and then Opal would come out with a number for you. So that number would have a certain level of noise, and this would be a more accurate answer than you would be able to find from a published data set that has been anonymized. That is truly anonymized, so you can't re-identify people easily. So whether different scientists would get the same answer, I would say, obviously, if you have poorly anonymized data that is re-identifiable, no. In this case, the answers you get from Opal are worse. But they are much more private, and they actually do protect privacy, as opposed to just having almost the raw data. Now, to your second point, can the noise be canceled? The noise on its own, so as I said, I've simplified things a bit here. The short answer to that is no. because of the existence, for example, if in one of the queries we would use differential privacy, there would be a budget. So there would be a number of queries you can ask, that query can be asked, and after that we will no longer be answering. And how one of the attacks that you could use to cancel out a noise is that you ask the same question over and over again, and so on. And eventually you'd be able to, average those answers out to cancel the noise. And the privacy budget ensures that this doesn't go, the level of certainty that you can have doesn't go below a certain minimum. So this to one side. The other ways that you can ensure that you can cancel the noise is, other than authenticating users, making sure the queries are logged and stuff like that, is specific query-specific noise. So you can't be asking the same question over and over again. And if you are, then we see that there's a problem. So we'll send an email and cut your access until you respond. Stuff like that.
Please, please.
So first of all, many thanks to all the speakers. I have a question for all the three of them, and it's about the right to be forgotten, the right of oblivion. So I would like to know a little bit by each of you, what are the links with the right of oblivion to anonymization, to the discussions in the ethics world, and also for GDPR provisions. I don't know if the GDPR says anything about this right to oblivion. So grateful if you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
I'm not sure what you mean by the right to oblivion for anonymization. If you could explain this.
Yes. It's just my reflection. I don't know if I'm going to the right direction, but when I think about anonymization of data, I think that we lose ownership of this data. So somehow we are not forgotten, but our individual features are lost in a group of other features. So it's a way to disperse our own individual data and information. So that's how I link the anonymization aspect.
Okay, interesting perspective. I think, as I see it, actually I think that these two things are a little bit different. On what sense? Anonymization is a tool to protect the data, I would say, on the controller's side. Okay, this is how, of course, there is not absolute anonymization, as Alice said before, and this is the point. And then, because for a data controller, when you have a data set, for example, of course, anonymization can be a tool that can, first of all, release you from the GDPR obligations, because anonymous data are not subject to data protection. And at the same time, you can use this data for several other purposes. So you don't need to ask for consent. You don't have any of the obligations there. You can use them for research. You can use them for whatever purpose you want. For the individuals, it's also a protection mechanism at the same time, because, for example, imagine a hospital that has data for all the patients and wants to use this data for research. And obviously, there are very, very big risks by using personal data in health research as such, and therefore protection mechanisms need to be placed. Anonymization is obviously a protection mechanism. If you can research on databases where still being able to extract value from the data, but at the same time preserving the identities of the individuals. So it's not so much linked to the oblivion, I would say, as you presented it. It's about protecting the individuals. And an anonymized data set does not mean that the data still do not exist in a different form under a different controller, for example. Maybe, give you an example, let's say a hospital anonymizes data to send them in a statistical office for further analysis, but still the hospital owns the data. So it's a protection mechanism. Whereas the right to be forgotten, I think it's a different thing. It's a right for the individual. So as an individual, I have the right to ask for the deletion of my data. Of course, if certain conditions are in place, because this is not possible in all cases. But if these conditions are met, I have the right to ask for the deletion of my data so as to protect myself from exposure that maybe happened accidentally or is not valid anymore, and so on. So I believe these two things come from a different perspective, although both of them at the end aim to protect the individual, but from a totally different perspective. I don't know if I answered your question. Maybe the other speakers.
Thank you for the question. I think, Athena, because that was yeah, the same thing that I thought about, the way they are linked. And that's what I wanted to mention in that spirit is exactly the anonymization is a technique which makes the biggest problems for not only for businesses, but also for the researchers, because there is always the controller has the obligation to anonymize data, and then you're put in a situation. Not all those people working at the controller are not always aware that if they remove only direct identifiers, that the indirect identifiers will identify the person, and that's the main problem facing also the researchers in some situation, because they ask, okay, I always say them, go step by step. Assess the information, assess the data in a combination, but they're not always aware what to combine with. And of course, about the right to be forgotten is a right which you can ask for. You're not obliged to do so, but you have the right to do if you want. If you link that way the identity. Sometimes personal data and privacy are sometimes the identity question, but not for all people. People see the things from different angles and they feel the things different. Even in the research processes, there are people which are involved in the research and they say, I don't want to be de-identified. I want to have my identity, exactly the point that you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, so my response is going to be in agreement to what the other speakers have said. I think, so the right to be forgotten, first of all, personally, I think if you send a request to a data controller for your data to be deleted, that data controller must be legally obliged to delete your data, not just store it anonymously, but delete that information. In the same way, I mean, okay, so you could say that, similarly, a bank, you could go close your account and remove your money, right? And the bank might say that, oh, but this is terrible for us, right? In the same way that a data controller might say, but no, we can't delete this, we've invested in this collection. But we're still living in a society where banks operate because no nation has gone in and removed all of their money from every bank. And I don't think that's going to happen in the same, I don't think that's going to happen in the same way for many data controllers. So I think, I don't think this really links to anonymization, because that's only when the data must be shared out with others. And yes, you could say, okay, you have sent us a request, so what we're going to do is we're going to try and anonymize your data, and I think that shouldn't happen. I think they should delete it, basically.
Any more questions from the audience? Yeah, please.
Sorry, I'm interested, what about incognito windows on our browsers? How do they really apply? And more and more people use VPNs in order to get some more privacy. So what are your thoughts about that? Thanks.
Okay. Obviously, these tools are in order to safeguard privacy. Let's say they fall under the what Bourka was saying before. What do we do to protect our own privacy? There are tools like that, but at least in my knowledge, they cannot do miracles. First of all, VPNs. There are several different ways of operation VPNs. It's not like, I mean, there are several, the most important question is who is the holder of the key in these cases. And in many instances, the key holder, the encryption key holder, I mean, stays with the VPN provider. So in that case, okay, it is a protection mechanism, obviously, but there's always the possibility for a third party to access the data. And so there are different implementations, of course. There are different types of VPNs, different types of providers. There are also other types of tools that can protect against tracking, like add-ons, browser add-ons, and so on. There are different tools like incognito, as you mentioned. I believe different browsers provide different types of functionalities. There are also more, let's say, tools that are aimed to protect anonymity, like the Tor browser, which is a step further than VPNs. There are several technologies that can be used. To which extent they protect, it depends on the objective that you have. For example, yes, there are several browser add-ons that protect against tracking, but what type of tracking? Cookie tracking. What about fingerprinting tracking? Which is much more silent and very difficult to find. So that's why I think, obviously, personally, I find these tools very useful, because I also agree with what Bourka was saying before, that there is also a personal responsibility for us as users. We can do our best to get informed, to use the tools that are there, and there are several tools out there as well. But also the other side always has the power, because they are the ones who are using the data. They are the ones who know what they do. We cannot always know everything. And the example of fingerprinting is, to me, very fundamental here, because cookies are the least. I mean, I've seen so many research and so many papers and regulations about cookies, but then at the end, this does not really exclude tracking and the more dangerous ones. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
So I think it's an interesting question, and I agree with everything that Athena said. Just to reiterate one thing is you have to know who is the attacker and who you're trying to protect yourself against. For example, with an incognito browser, the main benefit that you're getting there is that maybe you're making yourself blind to some advertisers online and you don't see what you've done in your own history. That's pretty much it. But beyond that, the ISP still knows, the search engine probably can figure it out, and lots of other things, unless you might even be signed into your incognito browser, which is a different story. So really thinking about who the attacker is crucial when you're trying to use a tool about these things.
Any follow-up questions or any questions from one panelist to another? Yeah, there's last question, please.
I still had a question. I mean, you say anonymization is not the answer. Okay, I do agree with big data, it's possible to make many links. But then again, adding noise is also not the answer, because for some of the research, like in medical research, where you try to learn from patient profiles, medications, treatments, I mean, any noise would just destroy the research.
Yes, so it's very application dependent. If we just say, yes, adding noise can destroy the research, this is true in certain areas. But in medicine, for example, we can get around these things. For example, currently in development are techniques called federated learning, where different hospitals, which have different silos of medical data, can collectively train a machine learning algorithm together without sharing their data with each other, with privacy guarantees on top. This is still in development. It's not like perfect and it's not working extremely well yet, but these tools are coming. Now, this is a variation of the principle of access control, where you're not sharing the data out with everyone, but you're getting people to come to you with their questions. And I think that is the principle that we should have in mind when we think about sharing personal data. It shouldn't be a balance between, oh, I give this data out versus, people will die if I don't. It should be, how do I give this data out while protecting privacy without making sure, by also making sure that it's used properly.
I only want to add that anonymization is also not the only way to protect data, especially for medical research, as you mentioned. And according to GDPR, for example, where as long as there is a legal basis for this research, it is explicitly mentioned that data can be reused for research purposes as long as there are adequate security guarantees. And again, data pseudonymization is mentioned explicitly there as a possible solution, which means that at the end you don't necessarily need to anonymize the data. You can pseudonymize the data, which is, lighter in that sense, and of course apply appropriate security measures and still do the work. But of course then you would have to consider anonymization when you would need to publish them online. This is a different thing, not necessarily linked to the research per se.
Thanks for the answer, but can I be more specific based on your last intervention? I know about a project where 18 university hospitals signed up and trying to find the best way treating a heart patient based on statistics out of treatment processes and results, which just fell apart when the GDPR became enforceable because no data controller wants to take the risk because they don't know what could happen if they share the data outside their own very protected area.
Okay, you mean about data sharing then? That's a different point, if I understand correctly. It's about sharing of data between different universities, different hospitals, yes? Okay, I think these are also, obviously you need to have the legal...
Sorry for shortcutting my question. If you want to learn more, my daughter's just teaching in Bern at the university a session on the project. So, it's not sharing data. The problem is you all have solutions, but the lawmakers never make it concrete enough that you can deploy it. Ask a researcher, what can I do and what can I not do? And you never get an answer. And if you never get an answer, the best way is just forget about the research because you cannot get it done.
Do you want to add?
So I think one point to be made here is that we're living in a time where we're just starting to properly battle with these questions as a governmental institution. The solutions, of course, maybe have existed in academia for a while, but it takes a long time, relatively speaking, for the academics to talk to the legal people and for the legal people to talk with themselves and eventually to come up with a law. And I think it's worth it for the future to do this properly and do this now rather than being afraid that if we don't act now, then people are going to die. And I appreciate that sentiment, but I think the benefit that we get from doing it properly outweighs the short-term risk that we have to incur.
Okay, I think we should conclude this very interesting discussion and very animated discussion. I think on Florent's question or comment that the GDPR or legislation does not spell out all the scenarios and what is allowed in all circumstances. I think that is impossible for any piece of legislation. I think the GDPR is already long enough and complex enough. But I think, and I'm sure, and we have seen that the privacy authorities have started and giving guidance, have applied cases, and I think there are also possibilities to contact them to see what they consider as compatible and not. So I think there are ways, and there are also specific provisions on research, as mentioned by Athena. And so I think I wouldn't be that pessimistic on the possibilities of research. I would like to thank the panelists for this very interesting contributions, and also the responsiveness to the questions. And I would close this session with this. Thank you.